The sky above the Wyoming Territory in late summer 1879 bled amber and violet as the sun dipped behind the dusty mesas. Heat clung low over the plains, though the wind had started to cool, whispering through dry grass and the worn slats of the fence line. A distant hawk called out once and then was gone. On the porch of Graves Ranch, silence pressed thick against the wooden beams, broken only by the quiet thump of footsteps approaching with the weight of miles walked. Ella Merritt paused at the top step. Her boots were scuffed, her shawl worn thin across her shoulders. In her right hand, she held a heavy cast-iron pot, still warm from a morning stew that hadn't seen many takers on the road. In the other hand was a soft, time-worn cookbook. Its spine cracked, the pages curled like petals from use. But it was a little girl clutching the back of her skirts that made her shoulders straighten. Daisy's small hand didn't tremble, but Ella felt how tightly she gripped. The child was scared but trusting, and that was harder. She knocked. The sound echoed like a stone dropped into a well deep and lonely. The door creaked open part way. On the other side stood a man, tall, solid, backlit by the low flame of a lantern hung behind him. His shirt was unbuttoned at the throat, the sleeves rolled to thick forearms dusted with hay and years of work. His hair was graying near the temples, and his face bore the kind of tired that didn't come from lack of sleep, but from the weight of carrying memories too long. Yes, his voice was rough, more growl than greeting. Ella lifted her chin just enough to meet his gaze. "I was told you need a cook." Colton Graves didn't answer right away. His eyes scanned the pot, the book, then stopped at the child peeking from behind her mother's skirt. She had tangled brown curls and enormous eyes more curious than afraid. The weight of her stare settled on him like a challenge not of defiance, but of belonging. She didn't ask for charity. She just stood there asking silently if this house had space for her too. He hadn't let anyone new into his home since his wife passed during a cruel winter fever. Not a guest, not a worker, not a friend. Since then, he'd run the ranch with hard hands and harder silence. He fixed his own fences, fed his own cattle, and buried his grief beneath the sound of wind over the hills. He'd survived by keeping people out. But something cracked. His gaze dropped for half a second to the girl's tiny hand, then back to Ella's steady eyes. He opened the door wider just enough. "I think I need a family," he muttered, and instantly regretted saying it aloud. Ella blinked, stunned. Daisy looked up at her mother, unsure. There were no further pleasantries, no promises. Just the scrape of the door easing open, the shuffle of Colton, stepping back into shadow. Ella hesitated, then guided Daisy forward. She set the pot down gently on the porch rail as though afraid a sudden sound might shatter the moment. "Thank you," she said softly. He didn't reply, but motioned them inside with a nod. The door closed behind them with a quiet finality, sealing them into a house that smelled of dust, old pine, and something faint and floral like a memory. The hall was dim-lit only by a flickering oil lamp near the hearth. Saddles and tools hung neatly from wall hooks, and above the fireplace a single portrait watched over the room. A dark-haired woman, eyes warm, face kind. She had once owned this space with grace. Ella adjusted her grip on the cookbook and stepped in, fully glancing back once to make sure Daisy followed. The girl moved carefully, taking it all in. She didn't speak. Colton gestured to a chair. "You can sit." Ella nodded grateful and guided her daughter to the worn seat near the fireplace. The little girl climbed up, legs swinging in the air. The warmth of the room wrapped around them, hesitant but real. Ella placed the pot beside the hearth, and for a moment none of them moved. Outside, the prairie wind continued to whisper along the eaves, but inside that house something else stirred, something less wild than wind, but far more human. It was the sound of silence being shared. The house was quieter than Ella expected, not just in volume, but in feeling. Every sound felt like it carried weight: the creak of a floorboard, the whisper of the fire, the low exhale of a man who had spoken too little for too long. Colton remained near the door for a moment before stepping deeper into the room. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer help, but he didn't turn them away either. And in Ella's experience, that was more kindness than most. She moved into the modest kitchen without waiting to be asked. A single shelf held a few jars, beans, coffee, cornmeal. An old pie tin sat beside a chipped enamel bowl, and a half loaf of bread, dry at the edges, had been left wrapped in a rag. Ella set the pot down on the iron stove, checking the firebox, and quietly adding kindling until the heat revived. The room slowly began to smell like garlic thyme and something long-forgotten care. Colton sat at the small table, elbows resting on the worn wood. He didn't speak, just watched her hands as she moved through his kitchen like someone born to make use of small things. Daisy, meanwhile, had curled up near the hearth, eyes blinking slow. She was fighting sleep, but the warmth of the fire and the rhythm of Ella's work were lulling her. Ella scooped the stew into 3 bowls, added slivers of bread beside each one, and placed a tin spoon on a folded napkin. Nothing fancy, just food meant to soothe. She set the first bowl in front of Colton without a word, then another beside the hearth for Daisy. The last she kept for herself. "It's not much," she said, breaking the silence, "but it's hot." Colton looked down at the food, then back at her. He picked up his spoon. No grace, no thank you, just a bite. Then another, and another. His face didn't change, but the way his shoulders eased said enough. Daisy took small, careful spoonfuls, pausing to blow on each. She seemed lighter now, as if the safety of warmth and food had given her permission to be a child again. Ella sat down opposite Colton, folding her hands for a moment before picking up her spoon. They ate in near silence, save for the gentle clink of metal on ceramic and the occasional pop from the fire. When the bowls were empty, Colton rose and carried his dish to the basin without a word. He washed it slowly, methodically. Ella followed with hers, setting it beside his. Their hands brushed once over the edge of the sink, and she noticed that his were rough but clean, used to work, not harm. She glanced toward Daisy, who had finished her stew and was now wiping her mouth with the corner of her sleeve. The little girl turned to Ella and said with innocent pride, "I can help clean Mama." Ella smiled. "Just the corner, sweetheart." Daisy grabbed a rag from the chair and began dragging it across the floorboards with the energy of a child desperate to be useful. But after a few turns around the table, her movements slowed. She wandered toward the fireplace and eased into the padded rocking chair nearby. It was an old piece, worn quiet in its creaks, and Ella sensed from the way Colton's posture changed that it hadn't been used in a long while. His gaze flicked to the chair, then back to the basin, but the lines around his mouth had softened. Daisy was asleep within minutes. The rag still in her hand, her small frame curled into the same curve the chair had once held for someone else. Ella didn't move, didn't speak. She simply watched Colton as he dried his hands and stood still facing the child who had unknowingly stepped into a sacred space. A long breath escaped him. Then, without a word, he turned and walked down the hallway. Moments later, he returned carrying a folded wool blanket patterned in deep rust and faded blue. He hesitated for a long beat, his hands trembling ever so slightly, then stepped quietly to Daisy's side. He draped the blanket over her shoulders, tucking the edges gently without waking her. Ella's breath caught. He said nothing, just turned and walked to the front door, opened it a crack, stared out into the dark. "Thank you," she whispered. Colton didn't reply, but his hand rested on the door frame longer than needed, like he was steadying himself against something heavier than the night. Behind them, the fire crackled low, and for the first time in a long time, the house smelled not just of wood smoke and leather, but of something warm and almost alive. By morning, the wind had quieted and left behind a stillness that only came after a storm, both outside and within. Ella rose before dawn, careful not to wake Daisy, who was curled beneath the same blanket that once wrapped another life. She began tidying the front room, folding cloths, wiping down windowsills, shaking out the fatigue of endless travel. She didn't expect Colton to already be up, but he was out in the corral brushing down an old chestnut mare whose gait had slowed with the years. Ella stood by the kitchen window watching as his hands moved with quiet rhythm like a man who didn't need to speak to be understood. The horse didn't flinch beneath his touch. In fact, she leaned into it. Daisy stirred as the sun stretched across the hardwood floor. She blinked, sat up, and whispered, "Mama, is it mornin'?" "It is," baby Ella said, brushing back the girl's hair with the palm of her hand. Later, after breakfast, Ella stepped out onto the porch with a glass of water, wiping her hands on her apron. Colton looked up when she approached, but didn't say anything right away. She sat on the top step, the quiet between them stretching comfortably for the first time. "She yours?" she asked, nodding toward the mare. Colton nodded. "Belle. Had her before the war. Still carries like she's got something left to prove." Ella smiled faintly. "That's a good name." "She was my wife's," Colton said. Ella's smile faded a little, not from discomfort, but from recognition. She understood what it meant to give a name meaning twice. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't pry. Instead, she took a breath and said, "I've never been a wife, but I've buried just the same." He didn't flinch, just let her words land. "I lost my father at Antietam," she said softly. "My brothers, too. And then, well, Daisy's father left before she learned to say his name." Colton looked up sharply, not with judgment, but with something more like recognition. "He left you alone." She nodded. "He left us. Claimed he'd come back with a house and gold. I found out he'd left a baby behind in Missouri, too. There was no house, just empty words." The wind shifted slightly, rustling the wheat-colored grass beyond the fence line. Colton ran his hand down Belle's neck again. "My wife Hannah died 2 winters ago. Fever hit fast. Took her before spring had the chance to melt." Ella didn't speak. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound hollow, but Colton seemed to appreciate her silence more than empty comfort. "She used to sit by the fire and read aloud," he said after a long moment. "Even when I didn't ask her to. Said the walls deserved better than quiet." Ella glanced toward the house. "They don't feel quiet anymore." "No," he agreed, "they don't." They lapsed into silence again, this time heavier with the shared ache of things lost. But beneath that ache was something gentler. A thread, a bridge. "I thought about giving Daisy her father's name," Ella said finally, staring at her fingers. "But he didn't earn it." Colton looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Names mean something," she added. "They ought to." He nodded slowly. "They do." Belle shifted her weight, her tail flicking at the morning air. Ella reached out, letting her fingers graze the mare's mane. "She reminds me of someone," she said. Colton raised an eyebrow. "Not him," Ella added quickly. "Someone better. Someone who kept going even when it hurt." He nodded again slowly. "Strong ones always do." That single sentence settled between them like a stone at the bottom of a river, heavy, unmoving, but clear. They stood there for a while, not needing more words. Sometimes pain doesn't ask for fixing. It asks only for room to breathe beside someone who understands it. And that morning, in the space between one scarred life and another, understanding quietly took root. By mid-afternoon, the air had shifted. Clouds rolled in low and dark, stacking above the plains like bruises waiting to burst. The wind, once gentle, now pressed against the sides of the house with intent. Colton had seen this kind of sky before. It was the kind that promised thunder and didn't bluff. Ella was inside sewing, mending a frayed hem on one of Daisy's dresses. The child sat nearby on the rug, humming softly to herself, piecing together paper scraps from a torn book into makeshift dolls. But a slow, insistent dripping from above interrupted the quiet. Ella tilted her head. Drip, drip, drip. It was coming from the ceiling landing in a shallow tin bucket under the bookshelf with a metallic ping. She sighed, set her needle aside, and stepped outside. Her eyes scanned the roofline until she spotted a board loose near the chimney, warped and curled from old rain. Colton was out behind the barn, hauling sacks of feed, when he heard footsteps approaching. He turned and nearly dropped the grain bag when he saw Ella marching toward him, a hammer in one hand, a bundle of replacement shingles under the other arm. "You shouldn't be climbing roofs," he said, frowning before she even opened her mouth. "And you shouldn't be letting rain into your kitchen," she replied without missing a step. He stared at her arms crossed. The last storm ripped that patch wide open. She continued, brushing past him. "I was going to fix it after supper, but the sky says that won't wait." "You always carry shingles?" he asked, trailing behind her. "No," she said, setting the ladder against the porch eaves. "But I'm not helpless if that's what you're thinking." "I wasn't," he replied. "I'm thinking you're stubborn, only when someone lets a hole leak into the pantry." The ladder creaked as she climbed. From the roof, the view opened wide golden fields bending beneath wind fences like stitched thread across the land, and a faint crooked road disappearing into gray. She didn't stop to admire it. She dropped to her knees and braced herself, fingers deftly lining up a shingle and hammering it in place. Colton followed her up with a grunt, boots thudding against the wooden rungs. "You do this often?" he asked. "Cooking feeds the belly," she said, handing him a nail. "But carpentry keeps the roof above it." He chuckled, a real laugh, short and surprised. Together they moved in rhythm. She aligned the boards, he hammered them down. The sound of wind was all around them, but the work held its own steady beat. A song of mended things, of effort, of unspoken trust. Then, just as she shifted to reposition a shingle, her foot slipped on a dust-slicked beam. The world tilted. Her breath caught. The sky spun. But before gravity could pull her down, a strong hand grabbed her wrist. "Got you," Colton said, voice low, breath shallow. His other hand pressed flat to the roof, anchoring them both. Ella clung to his arm, her heart hammering in her chest. Their faces were inches apart, close enough for her to see the gray at his temples, the deep lines around his eyes, the quiet storm in his gaze. She didn't answer. She couldn't. They stayed like that, frozen in a strange electric stillness. His hand didn't let go, and for that moment neither did she. Then from below, Daisy's voice rang out innocent and cheerful. "Mama, dinner's ready." The spell shattered. Colton helped her up with a grip that lingered just a second too long. She stood flushed, brushing dust from her skirt. "Thank you," she said quietly. He didn't answer right away, just nodded, eyes unreadable. They finished the last shingle in silence, the storm no longer the loudest thing between them. When they climbed down, the sky had begun to glow with that strange lavender light that comes just before the rain. The world seemed to hold its breath. Ella turned to him at the bottom step. "I mean it." "Thank you." Colton's jaw tensed, but his eyes held steady. "I meant what I said, too," he replied. "I've got you." She didn't speak, just turned and went inside, her pulse still pounding, not with fear, but with something else, something just as fragile and far more dangerous. The storm came slow and quiet that night, like a visitor unsure of its welcome. Rain whispered against the rooftop, and soft patterns and wind slithered around the corners of the house. Inside, the fire crackled steady, casting a warm glow across the living room. Daisy had fallen asleep early again, nestled in the rocking chair with a quilt pulled over her shoulders. Her tiny hand still clutched a button from the sewing box like it was treasure. Ella sat nearby, sewing with idle fingers, her thoughts somewhere far behind her eyes. She could hear Colton moving around in the barn, the faint clink of bridles and boots tapping on wood. It comforted her more than she cared to admit. When her thread ran out, Ella stood to return the sewing kit to the small table near the bookshelf. As she leaned down to place it, her knuckles grazed the edge of a drawer she hadn't noticed before. The wood was stiff, old. She hesitated. Then curiosity won. The drawer resisted, then gave way with a soft groan. Inside was a bundle of old letters, yellowed and tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Ella froze. She glanced around the room. No sound but rain, no eyes watching. With trembling fingers, she untied the ribbon. The paper smelled of cedar and thyme. The handwriting was tight, elegant, unmistakably feminine. She began to read. "Jonah, my love, I know the fever will win this time. There is so much I wanted to say, too much to fit in one note. But if you find this after I'm gone, please, please remember, do not let your grief become the house you live in. Grieve me, but don't bury yourself with me." Her heart caught in her chest. The letter wasn't meant for her, and yet it was exactly what she needed to hear. She finished reading, her throat tight, then folded the paper back carefully, tying the ribbon with the same gentle respect. She placed it in the drawer, closed it slowly, and stood motionless for a long time. That night, as supper simmered on the stove, she didn't speak of the letter. But something in her movements had changed. Her shoulders had dropped. Her hands no longer fluttered with uncertainty. Colton returned just before the rain deepened, Boots' damp hair tousled. He smelled of hay and wood smoke, a familiar scent, now one that no longer startled her. Supper was simple: beans, skillet cornbread, a pot of roasted carrots, and yet it felt like more. Daisy chattered about the stars and asked if she could feed the chickens tomorrow. Colton nodded, but mostly he watched Ella, not out of suspicion, not out of duty, but because something in her eyes looked lighter. After dishes were cleared, he did something he hadn't done since his wife passed. He picked up a second towel and dried the plates beside her. The air between them was no longer full of words unsaid, but of a rhythm shared. When Daisy yawned and rubbed her eyes, Ella led her to the bedroom. Colton remained behind, sitting in his usual chair by the fire. Minutes passed. Ella returned her steps soft. She paused at the doorway. The other chair, Hannah's chair, had been pulled slightly forward. She looked at him. He didn't say anything, just patted the cushion beside him once and waited. Ella hesitated, then crossed the room and sat down. Her fingers folded in her lap. The firelight flickered across their faces. "She always sat there," Colton said quietly, staring into the flames. Even when she was too weak to speak, she liked to listen to the wind. Ella looked toward the window, where the storm drifted past in sighs. "She was kind," she said. "I can tell by the way this house remembers her." He nodded. "She left you a letter, Ella added her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," he replied. "I just never opened the drawer again, until you did." The silence stretched between them like fabric. Then she asked gently, "Do you think you let your grief become your home?" He didn't answer right away. "I think it still tries to," he admitted. She looked down. "Maybe it's time to build something new. Not alone." Colton turned to her, then eyes deep and steady. "Maybe I need someone to help build it." And in that moment, they didn't need to speak of love or promises or past regrets. They were just two people scarred but standing ready to raise something out of the ashes. Not a mansion, just a home. The next morning broke with a silence too sharp to ignore. The birds didn't sing. The wind barely moved. Even the hens in the coop clucked in uneasy whispers. Ella felt at first a tension in the air like something holding its breath. Colton was out by the fence replacing a cracked rail. Daisy played on the porch with her rag doll, her bare feet swinging over the steps. Ella had just finished folding laundry when the sound of hooves echoed from the ridge road. She stepped outside, drying her hands on her apron. A rider approached. Not just one, but a man on horseback dressed in an elegant brown coat with polished boots that hadn't seen a hard day's work. Behind him trailed a wagon and two mounted deputies from town. The lead rider dismounted with a slow, deliberate grace. His smile was sharp, the kind of smile a wolf makes before it sinks teeth into a rabbit. "Good day, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "I believe we have mutual concerns." Ella stepped forward, her back straight. Daisy stopped playing and crept behind her mother's skirt. The man pulled a folded document from his coat. "Name's Curtis Langdon. I'm kin to the late Samuel Langdon by blood. That makes me legal next of kin to young Daisy here. I've come to collect her." Ella's hands balled into fists. "You're not his kin," she said, voice flat, "and you'll not touch my daughter." Curtis smiled wider. "I've got documentation. Santa Fe seal. Sworn affidavits. When the marshal comes next week, you'll have no choice but to comply." Behind him, the deputies watched warily, not eager to intervene. But they didn't have to, because Colton Graves had approached from behind shovel and hand boots heavy with earth. He didn't shout, didn't threaten, just stood on the porch steps between Ella and the man. "You're trespassing," he said, voice quiet. Curtis turned and took a step back when he saw Colton's size. "Mr. Graves, I'm told you're a reasonable man. I don't want trouble. This house isn't yours. And this child isn't yours," Colton replied. "I have rights," Curtis began. "No law gives a man the right to turn a child into a pawn." Colton cut in, stepping closer. "You come here with paperwork and lies, but you've got no claim. Not in this house." Curtis's smugness flickered for the first time. "You want to harbor someone against a legal order. I want to protect a little girl from being sold off like cattle," Colton growled. "You worked at Fort Lincoln, quartermaster's clerk. You bribed officers, smuggled maps west, and when you were caught, you ran. Don't think I don't know what you are." Curtis's expression froze. Ella stepped forward now, fire in her eyes. "I was there. I saw what you did. You used my daughter's father for access, and when things went south, you disappeared. Now you want to use Daisy to clean your record." Curtis tried to laugh it off, but the deputies no longer looked at him with respect. One of them shifted in his saddle, uncomfortable. Curtis's tone turned hard. "You'll be hearing from a federal court." Colton didn't flinch. "I already filed with one." And with that, he stepped back into the house and returned with a leather folder, documents stamped and notarized. He handed them to the deputy. "Guardianship papers," Colton said. "Filed yesterday, witnessed, approved, clarifying Ella Merritt as Daisy's legal mother and myself as guardian by stability clause. The deputy opened the folder, scanned the top page, and immediately dismounted. "Looks official," he muttered, "and binding." Curtis looked around, rage bubbling beneath his skin. "This isn't over." "No," Ella said, "it is." He mounted his horse without another word and rode off, dust spiraling behind him. The deputies didn't follow. They tipped their hats and rode the other way. Ella stood in the yard trembling with relief. Daisy clung to her skirt. Colton turned to them, expression still calm, but his jaw clenched. "You didn't tell me you filed all that," she said quietly. "I told you I've got you," he replied, "and I meant it." She stepped closer, blinking back tears. "You did all this for us." "No," he said, placing a calloused hand on her shoulder. "For family." That afternoon, as the storm clouds cleared and the prairie bathed in amber light, the wind carried no threat, only the echo of something deeply rooted, the sound of a promise that couldn't be bought or faked. A stand made not by blood, but by choice. The next few weeks passed not in peace, but in transformation, the kind that reshapes a place from the inside out. Ella no longer carried her pot and cookbook like a traveling stranger. Now they had a permanent place on the kitchen shelf. The meals she cooked filled more than bellies, they brought rhythm warmth, a scent that told the walls someone was home again. Daisy took to the ranch life, quickly gathering eggs from the coop and reading aloud from her favorite picture book as Colton mended fences nearby. There was laughter now. It lived in the corners, rested in the floorboards, and stirred in the curtains when the windows stayed open longer. But the real shift came on a Sunday afternoon. Colton was in the barn, adjusting the hinges on the stable door. Ella was prepping bread dough in the kitchen, her sleeves dusted with flour. Daisy was out front with a stick drawing shapes in the dirt. The wagon appeared slowly on the horizon, followed by 2 riders on horseback. It wasn't Curtis his threat had scattered like the dust he rode off in. This time it was the townspeople. At the front, Mr. Joseph Elliott stepped down from his buggy holding another sealed envelope in hand. Behind him came a slow trickle of familiar faces: the blacksmith and his wife, the baker, the school teachers, the sheriff, and more nearly 24 souls from the nearby town who had once kept their distance from the reclusive Colton Graves and the unknown woman at his ranch. Ella stepped out onto the porch, confused. Daisy ran to her side instinctively, grasping her mother's hand. Joseph smiled kindly. "We came to make something clear, just in case that man ever circles back." He handed over the envelope. Notarized town support, witness affidavits, proof of good character, just a bit of insurance. Before Ella could answer, the blacksmith's wife stepped forward with a covered basket. "She's fed half of us over the years without asking for a dime," she said. "It's time we brought something back." The schoolteacher nodded. "And Daisy's been helping the little ones learn their letters every week." More voices chimed in. "She fixed my husband's shirt when he tore it on the fence line. She traded her preserves for my mother's herbs. She listens when nobody else does. Gifts were offered: homemade loaves of bread, a jar of blackberry jam, hand-woven cloth, and even a new saddle for Belle." The blacksmith had worked on it for a week without saying a word. But perhaps the most beautiful gift came last. As the sun dipped low behind the hills, each person took a lantern from the wagon and hung it on the fence posts lining the yard. One by one, the lights flickered on, golden and gentle, stretching out like a path of hope. No words were needed, just presence. Ella stood on the steps, one hand over her mouth, eyes wet with tears she didn't try to hide. Daisy reached for Colton's hand, who stood just behind them, his eyes searching the horizon, but seeing something far nearer belonging. The blacksmith's wife said it simply: "Every home deserves light. This one has 3. That night, they didn't eat in silence. They passed food, shared stories, and laughed. Not loudly, but freely. Afterward, with Daisy curled up on the porch swing notebook in her lap, she wrote slowly by lantern glow. They say a house needs wood and nails, but I think it just needs 3 people who won't give up on each other. Inside, Ella sat beside Colton by the fire, not in the second chair this time, but on the same one. His hand rested at her back and hers over his. No one said the word love. They didn't need to. That ranch, once filled with silence and memory, now pulsed with something stronger than grief. Not perfection, not ease, but trust, care, and something rare out there on the edge of a hard world, a future. In the wide and restless West homes aren't always built with blueprints and beams. Sometimes they're built with courage, with late-night promises, with quiet mornings and unexpected kindness. This story reminds us that family isn't made by blood alone. It's made by the ones who choose to stay, especially when it's hard. Colton could have stayed in his silence. Ella could have kept running. Daisy could have been lost in legal battles and fear. But instead, they made a stand for each other, for belonging, and for a life built not on the past, but on hope. So, here's the truth. You don't need a perfect house. You don't even need a perfect past. You just need people who won't let go. If that moved you, if you've ever felt like you were building something fragile but real, drop a comment below. Tell us what home means to you. And if you believe in stories where quiet courage changes everything, don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell. Because here at Whispers of the Wild West, this is just the beginning. We'll see you on the next ride.